When you're painting something that's a solid color, opaque paints can make your life a lot easier. When you spray an opaque color at 100%, it'll always give you the same value and hue. And this could be very helpful when you need to add a solid value in your paintings, like the hood of this car. So this is the painting that we're going to be working on today. There's nothing too complicated in this one, and I'll go over all the techniques that I use to paint it. The first thing we're going to need to do is mix up our colors. This is the main color mixture that I use for the majority of this painting, and it's going to work like an opaque color. The reason that I'm saying that it's going to work like an opaque color is because I'm using two transparent colors and I'm mixing them with white. The white that I'm using is an opaque color, so it's going to add some opacity to the mixture. So for this first mixture, the only three colors that I'm using are scarlet red, orange, and opaque white. Now you might be wondering what the difference is between an opaque color and a transparent color. This color scarlet red is a transparent color, so when I place this down, you'll be able to see through the pigments. When you're spraying this through an airbrush, you're never going to lay it on this thick, but even when it's thick like this, you can still see right through it. Now, if I add on some of this opaque white, you'll notice that you're not able to see through this as easily as the red. And that's because the pigment in this one is titanium dioxide, which is an opaque pigment. So if you mix some of this white with the red, you'll get a new color that works like an opaque paint. This is the way that artists have been making opaque colors for hundreds of years, and it works exactly the same with oil paint. There are, of course, specific true opaque colors that you can buy, but this old technique really works great. And you'll hear plenty of terms out there from all different paint manufacturers that might seem confusing. Things like semi-transparent colors, semi-opaques, buffered colors, color stop colors. And honestly, it doesn't matter what you call it. All you need to know is that an opaque white mixed with any other color is going to add opacity to the mixture, and of course, it's going to lighten the value of that hue. I'm mixing up a reddish orange color for this one, so I added about 20 to 30 drops of red to about 15 drops of orange. And this color looks pretty good, but the problem with it is that since both of these colors are transparent, this final mixture is transparent. So what we want to do is just add some white to this mixture. That way we're going to add some opacity to it. You could add as much as you like. I'm adding about 15, 20 drops. Just remember that the more white that you add to this mixture, the lighter the value you're going to get, and also the more opaque it's going to be. And this is what the final mixture looks like, which is going to act as an opaque color in this painting. At this point, it might look pink. That's because when you mix red and white, you get the color pink. So if you're not happy with this, you could just add some more orange to it, or just add some more red. And it's important to remember that acrylic paints are always going to dry slightly darker. So off camera, I probably added about another 5, maybe 10 drops of red into this mixture. Again, play around with it and just mix the color that you want. Now, I drew this one on a smooth canvas that I prepared myself using a 2H pencil and a square grid. You could transfer this over any way you'd like. You could use a grid if you want. If you want to trace it, that's fine. Whatever, just to get your contour lines on your canvas. And I'm working on a video right now showing you in full detail how I set up my canvases and grids. So that'll come out in a month or so if you need some more help with that. And like always, I'll have the reference photos, the photoshopped images, and the gridded version all up on the members page. And if you're not a channel member and you're going to be painting along, of course, I still got you covered. So here is a photo of my completed painting. You could set this to full screen, take a screenshot of this, and use as your reference. So I'm starting with that color that we just mixed, and I'm going to spray it on the whole front of this car. You can see that I used some 3M vinyl tape along the left side. This way I'm masking off the background from the car itself. And all I did with that was line that up over my initial contour drawing. One thing I like to do when I'm painting is just kind of focus in on a smaller area. So I'm basically just painting in the top part of this hood. Now remember that this color is mixed with white, so I'm basically spraying it here at 100%, and I'm always going to get the same value. This is going to be a lot more forgiving than a transparent color, because to get an even layer of a transparent color, you have to spray an even amount, and that can be challenging over a larger area. So this white in the mixture is setting that value at a certain point, so it'll never be able to get darker than that value. So I'm going to go over these areas multiple times, spraying thin layers at a time, letting it dry for maybe 30 seconds or so, and then applying another layer. This way I'll get an even coat sprayed at 100% across this whole area. You may notice that even though I'm spraying this at 100%, you're still able to see through some of this color. So it has some opacity to it, but since we're using an airbrush, we're always spraying thin coats of paint. So even if you're using the most opaque color you can use, sometimes you could still see through it just because it's so thin. But regardless of the opacity, this white in the mixture just helps prevent this color from getting too dark. So you can see that after I spray this on, we get a pretty even value of this reddish color across the whole hood. And we're going to use this red as our base midtone. If we need to add some highlights to it, we can use some lighter paint, or we could erase into it. And if we need to darken it, we could spray a transparent darker color over the top. There's many ways to paint. Neither's right, neither's wrong. So I'm going to go over a bunch of different techniques here, and you could decide which ones you like, which ones you may want to use on your own paintings, and which ones you don't. And that's what painting's always been about for me anyway. Always trying to experiment, always trying to learn new things and improve. Now, I want to add a highlight on the top of this hood where it's reflecting some light. There's a ton of ways to go about this. You could erase into it to pull out your highlight. You can add an opaque color. You could use a brush, add that on top. You could use a colored pencil. There's really endless possibilities. So I'm going to show you one right here, which is a very common technique, and that's spraying an opaque lighter color over the top. When you spray a lighter opaque color that has white mixed in it over an existing color, you're going to get a very strange blue-gray shift. The color that I'm using here is opaque white with some orange mixed into it. This helps just to kind of mitigate that blue shift. But even with some of that orange mixed into the color, you can still see that this highlight looks slightly grayish. And we can fix that later by spraying a transparent color very lightly over the top of this. We could use transparent orange, or we could use some transparent red mixed with orange. And that thin glaze is just going to help knock down some of that blue shift. I'm going to add another highlight to the right here where the hood of the car is reflecting the light source. And I'm using a shield to help paint this in because I want these lines very sharp. This is something that I talked about in that metal painting tutorial I released about 6 or 7 months ago. And in that one, we painted a hammer. It's a simple little still life painting. But in that one, I went over what makes something look reflective or shiny in a painting. And to put it very simply, is about a high contrast of values, meaning very bright brights and dark darks right next to each other. That's going to give that illusion that something looks like metal or reflective. If that sounds confusing or I lost you, don't worry. I'm going to go over plenty of examples within this painting. I'm placing a small photo up of my completed painting on the left side of the screen here so you can see what I'm painting towards. There's a very subtle shift of light on the left side of the hood right here, as you can see on the reference. So I just sprayed a small amount of this light whitish color over the top. And what I'm doing here is going back to that opaque red mixture and then just cleaning up some areas. I'm using some shields to sharpen some of these lines. And I'm also going to lightly spray this color over that white just to kind of blend it and also knock down some of that gray. You could see just a thin layer here just helps shift it more toward a red. So that helped, but it still has a slight gray tone to it. That's not a problem. We're going to come back to this at the end of the painting and fix it. I can also use this red with my shield to sharpen up this line by spraying just above it. Now, if you'll notice on my completed painting, there's a thin bright highlight that goes along the front of this hood where it's reflecting some of that light source. Normally, I would erase this out, but let me show you how to do it with an opaque color. I'm going back to that white color mixture and then using my shield to line up with my initial line drawing. You can see the pencil lines here that I drew in showing me where this highlight's going to be. And then where this bright specular highlight is, I'm just going to spray it in freehand. When you spray it in freehand, you're going to get a very nice soft transition and it's going to make it look natural. So let's move along to this headlight and I'm going to show you a different technique. This time I'm going to be using transparent colors and erasing techniques. And the first thing I'm doing is using a piece of Frisket, placing this right over the top of it, and then cutting out the outline with an X-Acto blade. Once that's cut out, when we spray into this, it's going to give us a very sharp outline along the outside of it. And that's what you're going to see a lot of throughout this painting, a bunch of different masking techniques. A lot of airbrush artists print out an image and then use it to cut out stencils and spray over that. That technique is great and works well too. But since my focus has always been drawing based, I like to start with a pencil drawing first using a grid. It's just more comfortable for me. So the color that I have in my airbrush now is some black reduced with a bit of distilled water. And this is Createx illustration colors, so it's going to be very easy to erase out. And what I'm doing here is looking at my reference, and then I'm just kind of squinting my eyes and try to notice where I see some darker values and some lighter values. Squinting your eyes is a very old trick, and it really works great. What it does is it just kind of simplifies everything, so you just see large masses of dark and light. It's not a technique for everyone, but I always found it extremely useful. And the whole purpose of squinting is just to simplify everything that you're looking at. Sometimes if you're looking at a reference photo or something from life, it can kind of get overwhelming because there's just so much detail in there. So you can see in my painting right now, this looks almost kind of blurry, right? It's very soft and it almost looks abstract. But But as I remove the frisket, suddenly we have this sharp outline along the outside of it. And then I can use an electric eraser to focus on the really bright areas within this headlight. Again, I'm not really concerned with trying to get this perfect. I kind of want to just paint the impression of it, get those darks in and get the bright highlights in. As long as I get those darks and lights next to each other, this is going to give the effect that it's shiny or reflective. Once these areas are erased out, I notice that it still needs some darker shadows in between them. So I'm going back to my airbrush, mainly doing this all freehand, and just spraying some more of this black paint in. If I want some softer highlights and some gradients in here, I'm going to use my stick eraser. And this is why I'm painting on a gessoed surface. It's going to allow me to soft erase into the paint. When I want an area brighter, I use more pressure, and this works just like graphite drawing. To get this sharp dark line at the bottom, I'm using a black colored pencil. So you may notice at this point that there's some overspray from this black paint and the red paint in the background. So what I'm going to do is hide all that by painting in the background black. You can mask this off any way you want. If you want to use frisket, that works fine, but I'm just going to use a shield and I'm going to slowly work my way around here, just spraying over the shield to give me a sharp line. I like using a shield and moving it around because you get a lot of control. I used vinyl tape before to give me that sharp line of the red, and if there's any imperfections in that or some bumps, I can use this shield to clean them up. Once I have those edges and curves in, I can switch over to the airbrush freehand and spray the paint around it. When I'm doing this, I'm always trying to focus my airbrush in the opposite direction that the car is in. This way overspray goes to the left and stays off the right side of the painting. I'm going to follow the same technique as I move along to the right side of the painting, and just make sure that you go slow here. It looks like I'm going fast because this video is sped up, but trust me, I'm always taking my time and just spraying lightly. Of course, you could always mix your masking techniques to give you different curves and shapes. The bottom part of this car is pretty straight. It has a few curves in it, so 3M vinyl tape is going to work well here. But the left side over here has a lot more detail in it, so I'm just using frisket film and then cutting it out. And once I have these two areas masked off, I can use some blue painter's tape to block off the lower part of the painting. And once I have this all masked off, I'm going back to that red color mixture, spraying over it. Again, I'm focusing my airbrush to the left here, so overspray does not get on the right side of the painting. And some of these areas are going to need some black paint later, so I'm just spraying around them freehand. It doesn't matter if some overspray gets on them, because that darker color is going to cover them up anyway. And for the right side to mask it off, I'm just using a shield, spraying over it, and then filling in the rest. For the side of the car, I'm going to use both masking techniques again, some 3M vinyl tape at the bottom, and then some frisket around both of the wheels and toward the back. There's going to be a lot of reflections on the right side here. So the first thing I'm doing is starting with that red color, and just like before, laying in the base tones. This area right here is pretty much a solid color, so I'm spraying in the color 100% here, and the same thing along the bottom. If I need to sharpen up some areas, I'll use my shield, spray over it, that way I get those sharp transitions. This is going to be really important for reflections. And the great thing about using this opaque color here is that it'll never get too dark, even if I spray 100%. So once I get in some of these major reference points using this red color, I'm just going to lightly spray a thin glaze of it over some other areas just so I have some paint down. To pull out the highlights here, I'm going to use a different technique. Instead of using an opaque white to spray in here, I'm using my eraser. On this part of the door, you'll notice that it's not as dark as some of the other areas. This is because I sprayed less paint. So even though I'm using an opaque paint here, I can still get lighter values from it just by spraying less. And when the paint is applied lighter like this, it's just a lot easier to erase into. So I'm erasing out this small reflection right here, just using some horizontal strokes. You may notice that this area that I'm erasing into has a lot more texture. It's a lot grainier than the area that we painted in using that opaque white. But if you want this smoother, you could use the same technique that we did on the hood for that highlight by going back to that white opaque paint and spraying this in rather than erasing it. Either technique is fine. It's all personal preference. It's one of the cool things about painting. Some people are going to like everything really smooth and blended, and other people are going to like more texture or brush strokes. And I can never tell you which technique is better or which one is the right one to use. That's really going to be up to you. I'm just showing you a bunch of different techniques that I know in this video, and you could decide how to implement them on your paintings. Or better yet, maybe you have a completely different way of going about this style of painting. And if you do, let me know down below in the comments. I'm always interested in hearing different ways of painting. And if you get a chance, there's an artist on YouTube here named Stephen Leahy who has such a cool approach to painting cars. His techniques are very different from mine, but he just does such incredible work. I'll have a link to his YouTube channel down below. I definitely recommend checking it out because you'll see a completely different way of painting. I'm a huge fan of his paintings and techniques. I think he's way better at painting cars than I am. And this goes back to the idea that I'm always talking about, that there's no right way to paint. There's plenty of options, plenty of techniques out there, and the more you're aware of, the better you'll become. So I'm switching over to the color Burnt Umber here, which is like a desaturated orange, kind of a brownish color. I'm spraying this along the bottom, and this is going to work very well for some of the shadows that I still want to be warm. I want the color to still kind of fit in with that red-orange range. When I want a straight line like this area here, I'm going to use my shield. This way I'll get a straight line at the bottom and a soft transition at the top. This burnt umber is just not getting dark enough, so I'm going to go back over these areas with the shield and some black paint. I want this reflection here to be dark and very sharp, so I'm using a piece of Frisket right over my painting and cutting it out. And after I spray over it with some black paint, I get a very sharp line in there. The side of the car here is reflecting the road, so it's killing off some of that red and some of that saturation. So I could use a small amount of this transparent black and then just lightly glaze it over the top. Not only does this darken the area, but it also desaturates it. And then for the highlights in between these shadows, I'm going to go back to my eraser to erase these out. Again, the eraser on a gessoed canvas is going to give you some texture. So if you're not a big fan of this and you want everything smooth, you could just use your airbrush with some opaque white, and that'll give you a very smooth highlight. I want another shadow here that has a curve, so instead of using my shield, I'm going to use a piece of Frisket. Once I cut this out, I could just lightly spray over it. That gives me a sharp, thin line. But a problem with Frisket is that sometimes it's hard to cut out a very smooth line. I didn't do a great job here. This curve is kind of jagged, so I'm going to use an airbrush shield, place this over it, and then spray over the top again, just along that edge to smooth it out. If you need straight lines, another great technique that I love to use is just using two pieces of painter's tape, running them parallel to each other. Unlike vinyl tape, painter's tape always goes on straight. So if you spray over it and then remove this tape, you're going to get a perfectly straight line. And for this small curve on the end, I'll go back to my shield. Now, if you need to paint in a curve and you don't want to use Frisket and you don't have a shield that fits, 3M vinyl tape works so well for this. I want to paint in a thin line that has a subtle curve and is sharp on both sides. I can't use painter's tape here because that's always going to give me a sharp line, so I could line up the vinyl tape parallel to each other, mask off the sides of it using some of that painter's tape, then spray over it. And you can see that that does a great job at giving you a curve with sharp lines on the top and bottom. And I'm well aware that I'm going over a lot of different techniques very quickly, but that's kind of what this tutorial is about. I just want to show you a bunch of options available. Now for this curve on top, I can also use vinyl tape or Frisket, but I'm going to use a shield here. And then for this area inside here where the paint is reflecting some of the grass, it's kind of a dark color, so I'm just going to use this black and spray in a bunch of soft dots here, just some subtle texture. And one thing I want to point out is that when you're painting with the color black, it tends to get very dark very quickly. So you need to be careful with it. Just spray a little bit, see what it looks like. If you need to darken it later, you could always spray more. I want to add some lighter value and some texture into this highlight. So I'm going back to the eraser, just erasing out some parallel lines. If you watch any of my portrait painting tutorials, you'll know that I always say that observation is the most important skill you could learn. In a lot of those, I talk about some basic anatomy, and I think anatomy is important, but it's always going to be second to your observation. So let me give you an example here. On this painting right now, I'm painting out this dark oval shape, and I'm using some Frisket that I cut out to spray over it with some black paint. And on this car, I honestly have no idea what this is called. It looks like some sort of vent, some sort of hole. You know, I really don't know. But just because I don't know the name of it doesn't mean I can't paint it because I'm observing it. I see the shape of it, I see the color, and I see the value. As long as I'm able to observe that, I'm able to paint it. And to relate this back to portrait painting, don't get me wrong, anatomy is very important. Knowledge and learning is always going to be a good thing. But with that said, observation, meaning your ability to see values, colors, and shapes, is really the key to becoming a better painter. At least it's always been for me anyway. And it's always been something that I've been striving to improve in myself and in my paintings. So the last thing I want to go over in this video is using opaques to paint your highlights. As I said before, maybe you're not a fan of using an eraser because you get too much texture. So here I'm going back to that white color mixture and I'm using this to spray in this highlight along the top. I used my shield along the bottom just to define that sharp edge. And then from here, I'm just going to spray most of this in freehand. So when I do this, I get that sharp line at the bottom and then I get a softer gradient on the top. And if you compare this to my erased out highlights below it, you'll notice two major differences. One is that this is definitely a lot smoother. and the other is the color slightly different. You can see that this clearly looks more gray, and that's because of that blue shift that you get when you spray an opaque white. That blue mixed with that red orange underneath gives you a gray, because blue and orange are complementary colors. And when you mix any complementary colors, they desaturate and move toward gray. Now, when I remove the frisket, you can see the sharp lines that we get underneath. There's a lot more work that we're going to need to do to this to fix this up and to get it to look like the final painting, but that's where I'm going to wrap up the first part of this video. If I went over a lot of information too quickly, I do apologize for that. I just try to keep the time limit down on these videos just so they're not too long. In next week's video, we're going to be finishing up this painting and we're going to be working on the stuff that you're seeing on the screen right now. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this one and I hope you learned something. And of course, I want to say thank you so much to the kind and generous support of the channel members. First of all, I'd like to give a shout out to the 2 newest members, Israel and Erland at a tier 3. Thank you so much for that. It's really generous. So welcome, guys. And thank you so much to the current channel members for their continued support. That includes NH, Adrian, Joshua, Herbert, Svavar, Fernando, Takuji, Airbrush Art and Customs, Hector, Mike, Peter C, Peter G, William, Rick, Robin, John, Adam, Jan, Rick, M. Webb, Leon, Mackie Mark, Mere Creative, SM, Cyril, Michael, Carl, Dwayne, Pete, Ken, M. Shibley, and Ralph. And thanks everyone for watching. I'll see you all back here next Friday.